The intercom buzzed while I was reviewing Mrs. Peterson's blood work results. Dr. Anderson. Sarah's voice had that nervous edge I recognized immediately. I pressed the button and waited for her to continue. There's an insurance auditor in the lobby. He brought visitors with him. I set down the chart and asked what kind of visitors she meant. The pause told me everything before she answered. Your family, sir. I closed the patient file and walked out of the exam room into the empty hallway. 12 years I'd spent building this clinic from nothing, treating families in this Boston suburb, and now my own family showed up with an insurance auditor. The lobby came into view as I turned the corner near reception. Stephen Park stood by the front desk wearing a gray suit and holding a briefcase. Mid-40s, Asian American, neutral expression that gave nothing away. Behind him stood Rachel in a designer blouse and pearl necklace, arms crossed with that smirk I remembered from childhood. My parents flanked her on either side, Robert with gray hair and a polo shirt, Linda in a floral dress, both wearing identical expressions of righteous concern. 8 years since I'd seen any of them. Park noticed me first and asked if I was Dr. Michael Anderson. That's me, I said. Rachel's smirk widened as she corrected him. No, that's Michael Harris. He's the receptionist here. I looked at her and said nothing while Park's expression shifted to confusion. He mentioned that the clinic registration listed Dr. Anderson as medical director, but Rachel insisted I was lying. I kept my face neutral and suggested we talk somewhere private, then led them past Sarah's desk toward the conference room. Sarah looked panicked and started to ask what was happening, but I quietly told her to hold my appointments. Rachel followed close behind me, watching as I gave instructions like she thought it proved something. The conference room was small with a table for 6 and a whiteboard on one wall. My medical license hung next to the whiteboard with my name clearly visible to anyone who looked. Everyone took seats while Park opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. I folded my hands on the table and waited without saying anything. Rachel glanced at the wall, saw the license, then looked away quickly. Park opened his notebook and started to address me as Mr. Harris, but I corrected him immediately. My legal name was Michael Anderson, not Harris. He made a note and explained he was here regarding a formal complaint filed with the Massachusetts Insurance Commission. Rachel announced she'd filed the complaint because I was committing fraud. Park pulled out papers and set them on the table between us, explaining these were serious allegations about insurance fraud and practicing medicine without a license. Rachel reached into her purse and produced a printed photo showing me at the reception desk answering the phone. She said she'd taken it 3 weeks ago and claimed I was just administrative staff who told patients I was a doctor. Robert leaned forward and said they were my parents and knew my history. Linda added that I'd barely finished high school and never attended medical school. Rachel mentioned she worked in insurance and knew fraud when she saw it. Park looked at me and asked if I had a response. I pulled out my phone and sent a 3-word text to Margaret Chen. Need you now. I'm calling my attorney, I said. Rachel laughed and started to protest, but Park reminded her that everyone had a right to legal counsel. I set my phone down, and we waited in silence for 10 minutes while Rachel kept staring at me like she expected me to crack under the pressure. I didn't. The door opened and Margaret Chen walked in. 53 years old, Korean American, wearing a sharp suit and carrying an expensive briefcase. I stood to greet her while she addressed me as Dr. Anderson, emphasizing my title loud enough for everyone to hear. We shook hands before she cut off Rachel's protest and introduced herself as my attorney, adding that I was the owner of Boston Family Medicine. Chen set her briefcase down and told Park she needed to see the formal complaint before we continued. Park slid the folder across the table while Chen read through it with an expression that revealed nothing. She looked up and asked who had filed such serious criminal allegations. Park explained that Rachel Harris had filed it with supporting affidavits from Robert and Linda Harris. Chen looked at Rachel, then at my parents, and said she understood the situation. Park cleared his throat and began reading the complaint aloud. It alleged that Michael Harris was practicing medicine without a license, using a stolen identity of Dr. Michael Anderson to deceive patients, performing medical procedures without training, and defrauding insurance companies by submitting claims under false credentials. Rachel's signed affidavit claimed she'd witnessed me examining patients and prescribing medication. My parents' co-signed statement confirmed I had no medical education. The photo evidence supposedly showed me performing administrative duties at the reception desk. Chen tapped the folder and asked Park if he'd verified any of these claims before coming here. He admitted he was still in the process of verification, which prompted Chen to ask if he'd really shown up based solely on this complaint without checking state licensing databases first. Park shifted in his seat and explained the complaint had appeared credible, given it came from family members with detailed evidence. Chen opened her briefcase and pulled out a Massachusetts name change certificate dated April 2013. She explained that my legal name had been Michael Anderson for 12 years now, which made Rachel immediately claim that was convenient. Chen pointed out it was public record and I'd changed my name when I got married in 2013. Linda's voice came out small and uncertain when she asked if I'd gotten married. I spoke for the first time in 15 minutes. Divorced in 2015, kept the name professionally. Robert stared at me and said they hadn't known about any of this. I reminded him they hadn't asked, and we'd had no contact for 8 years. Rachel recovered quickly and argued that changing my name didn't prove I was a doctor, suggesting I could have changed it to hide something. Chen asked who exactly I would be hiding from when I ran a public medical practice. The phone rang outside the conference room. Sarah's panicked voice came through the door calling for Dr. Anderson, so I stood and walked out to the reception desk visible through the window. Sarah was handling one line while another kept ringing, so I picked it up and answered with the clinic name, then switched to the second line and identified myself as Dr. Anderson. An elderly patient needed a prescription refill, so I pulled up his file on the computer, verified the medication, and submitted the refill request to his pharmacy. I hung up and returned to the conference room. Rachel was on her feet looking triumphant, insisting this proved I was just reception staff. I sat down and explained my receptionist had been overwhelmed, so I helped her. Rachel argued that doctors don't answer phones, to which I replied that I do when my team needs help. She turned to Park and insisted this was exactly what she'd been talking about, that I thought answering phones made me a doctor. Chen pulled out another folder containing text message screenshots with timestamps clearly visible. She showed Park messages from October 15th, where Rachel had asked me for an urgent $50,000 loan because her business was failing. The messages revealed that our parents had co-signed her loans and would lose their house if she defaulted. Rachel's texts said I was her brother and owed her help because family helps family. My response had been simple. We hadn't spoken in 8 years and I didn't owe her anything. Chen's voice turned cold as she pointed out that Rachel had filed this complaint on October 18th, exactly 3 days after I refused the loan. Rachel's face went pale as she insisted that wasn't why she'd filed the complaint. Chen asked her to explain the real reason then. The silence stretched out uncomfortably while Robert turned to Rachel and asked if she'd really requested money from me after telling them she was reporting fraud because it was the right thing to do. Linda's voice cracked as she asked if Rachel had lied to them. Robert studied my face like he was seeing me for the first time in years. Linda stared at the medical license hanging on the wall behind me. Robert asked slowly if those licenses were real, and I confirmed they were. He asked if I'd actually gone to medical school. Johns Hopkins, graduated 2011. Linda's eyes filled with something that might have been tears as she asked why I hadn't told them. I reminded her I'd invited them to my graduation, but they hadn't come because Rachel's work event had been scheduled the same weekend. Robert blinked and asked if that had really been 13 years ago. 14. June 2011. Rachel's voice rose as she accused me of manipulation, but Park closed the folder and everyone went quiet. He explained this situation required a thorough investigation and he'd need documentation from Dr. Anderson, if that was truly my legal name. Medical license, board certifications, education transcripts, and clinic ownership papers would all be necessary. Chen asked when he wanted these documents. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Rachel stood abruptly and protested that giving me until tomorrow would let me fake documents. Park reminded her he'd be verifying everything directly with state agencies, and documents were either legitimate or they weren't. He stood and packed his briefcase while explaining he'd also be contacting the Massachusetts Board of Medicine and Hopkins University personally. He looked at Rachel with a serious expression. If Dr. Anderson's credentials are real, this complaint is false. Filing a false complaint with a state agency is a crime. Rachel sat down hard while my parents started to stand from their chairs. Chen's voice stopped them immediately, suggesting they should stay for a moment. Robert bristled and mentioned they had a right to leave, but Chen explained they'd signed legal documents accusing her client of criminal fraud. If I was innocent, and she emphasized that I was, they would face consequences for their actions. Rachel's voice came out thin and uncertain. What consequences? Chen listed them methodically. Defamation, filing a false police report, and interference with a medical practice. She pulled out her tablet and noted that I treated 40 patients per week, so if this complaint damaged my reputation, they'd be liable for my lost income. Linda's hands shook as she insisted they hadn't meant any harm. Chen's response was precise and unforgiving. They'd signed an affidavit in front of a notary, which wasn't the same as meaning no harm. I looked at my parents and stated plainly that they'd tried to destroy my career. Robert stood and started to explain what they thought was happening, but I cut him off by pointing out they'd believed Rachel's story without checking any facts. Like always. I stood up and everyone else followed until the small conference room felt even smaller. I asked a simple question about when my birthday was, which made Linda look confused. Robert tried to dismiss it as irrelevant, so I provided the answer myself. It's today, December 30th, 1989. I'm 35. Linda's face went completely white as I continued speaking in a quiet voice. They'd come here on my birthday to accuse me of fraud because Rachel had convinced them I was a failure. They hadn't called to verify anything or check any facts. They'd just believed her immediately. Rachel's voice broke as she told me to stop playing the victim, but I ignored her and addressed Park's upcoming return tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I told all three of them that he'd see my medical license, my hospital credentials, and my patient records documenting 8 years of treating families in this community. Then they'd have to explain to him why they'd filed a false complaint. Park walked to the door with Chen following him out. Rachel and my parents stood frozen in place while Rachel whispered something about how people could fake licenses these days. I picked up my phone and saw the calendar alert reminding me about my 35th birthday, then dismissed it without any emotion. Come back tomorrow, see for yourself. Robert's voice came out small and uncertain, suggesting that if I really was a doctor, but I interrupted him before he could finish. They'd find out everything in the morning and they shouldn't be late. They left one by one until I stood alone in the empty conference room staring at the chairs they'd occupied. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., everything would change for all of them. The truth had a way of doing that. The conference room looked exactly the same the next morning when I arrived at 8:45 with my coffee in hand. Chen sat beside me with 3 thick folders arranged precisely on the table. She'd spent the evening gathering every piece of documentation Park might need to verify my credentials. My parents arrived at 8:57 looking exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes and wrinkled clothes that suggested they'd spent the night arguing. Rachel walked in at 8:58 with perfect makeup and a confident stride that didn't quite hide the slight tremor in her hands. Park arrived at 8:59 carrying a folder twice as thick as yesterday's. He set it on the table with a heavy thud that made Rachel's eyes lock onto it immediately. Park greeted everyone and explained he'd spent yesterday evening making calls and checking databases, then opened his laptop without further preamble. The screen came to life showing the Massachusetts Board of Medicine website as he explained he'd searched the state licensing database. His fingers typed Michael Anderson, MD, into the search field. The results appeared instantly on screen with my license information displayed for everyone to see. License number MD 48291. Issued November 2014, specialty listed as family medicine, status showing active with no restrictions. Rachel leaned forward and insisted that had to be someone else with the same name, but Park scrolled down to show the license listed this clinic's address and my date of birth, December 30th, 1989. That's me, I said quietly. My parents leaned forward to stare at the screen while Rachel's face lost several shades of color. Park closed the laptop and opened the thick folder he'd brought, laying out documents one by one in a methodical sequence. The first page showed a certified copy of my Johns Hopkins University diploma, followed by my medical license certificate, then my Massachusetts General Hospital residency completion certificate, and finally the deed showing I'd purchased this clinic building. Park's expression changed as he looked up from the documents. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned to Rachel, then back to me again. His face literally fell as the full realization hit him. the shock and understanding crossing his features in a wave I could see from across the table. "Dr. Anderson," he said slowly. Rachel started to protest that I wasn't a doctor, but Park cut her off with a single statement that filled the room with stunned silence. "I was the owner of this clinic," he explained, having purchased the building in 2016 for $890,000. His insurance company had credentialed me since 2016, making me not just an employee but the medical director and only physician practicing here. He looked at Rachel and asked why my family thought I was a receptionist. Rachel's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Robert's hands started shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. Linda's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks, while I kept my expression completely neutral. Park continued laying out more documents that formed a complete picture of my education. High school transcript from Westbrook High in Connecticut showing a 3.8 GPA, not the barely graduated failure my parents had described to him. Associate's degree from Lakewood Community College with a perfect 4.0. Bachelor of Science in Biology from University of Ohio with a 3.9 GPA. Doctor of Medicine from Johns Hopkins Medical School in 2011, graduated with honors. Family medicine residency at Mass General Hospital from 2011 to 2014. Park addressed my parents directly and reminded them they'd claimed I barely graduated high school. Robert stared at the transcripts like they were written in a foreign language he couldn't quite comprehend. Park explained he'd verified every document yesterday by contacting each institution personally. Linda's voice came out as barely a whisper when she asked if I'd really attended Johns Hopkins, one of the best medical schools in the country. "Fourth best, actually," I replied. The professional records came next in another systematic wave that left no room for doubt or denial. Massachusetts medical license issued in 2014 and renewed every 2 years through the present. Board certification from the American Board of Family Medicine in 2015. DEA license authorizing me to prescribe medication. Active hospital privileges at St. Mary's Hospital. Credentialing with 8 different insurance companies including Park's. Patient registry showing 2,947 patients treated since I'd opened this practice in 2016. Park noted I had 0 malpractice claims and 0 complaints filed with the medical board. He pulled up another screen showing my patient satisfaction scores, 4.8 out of 5, and insurance claims totaling $1.4 million paid out between 2016 and 2024. Every single claim had been properly documented and every procedure fully justified by medical necessity. He looked directly at Rachel and reminded her she'd filed a complaint accusing me of insurance fraud when I was actually one of their highest-rated providers. Robert's voice cracked when he finally spoke. "You're a doctor, a real doctor." I confirmed this simple fact while Linda processed the reality that I owned this entire clinic and had purchased the building myself. Robert asked why I hadn't told them any of this, and I reminded him that I had told them. They just hadn't listened. Linda insisted they would have remembered something this important, which prompted Chen to pull out another document from her folder. The graduation announcement I'd sent to their Connecticut address on June 15, 2011, complete with the RSVP card they'd returned saying they couldn't attend because of Rachel's work event that same weekend. Chen produced a stack of Christmas cards I'd sent every year until 2017, all returned marked wrong address because they'd moved in 2018 without telling me their new location. The evidence of their systematic abandonment sat there on the table for everyone to see. Park turned his attention to Rachel and asked her to clarify her employment status in the insurance industry. She stammered that she had worked in insurance but no longer did, which made him press for the specific date she'd stopped. Chen answered for her, March 2023, when Northeast Insurance had terminated her employment for ethics violations. Rachel protested that her employment record was private information. Chen explained it was entirely relevant given that Rachel had filed an insurance fraud complaint while claiming expertise in the industry. She asked why Rachel hadn't used her access to provider databases to search for my credentials before filing. Rachel insisted she had searched but used Michael Harris as the name, which Park immediately noted was incorrect since my legal name had been Anderson for 12 years. A simple database search would have shown this within seconds. Rachel claimed she hadn't known about the name change, which Park pointed out was because she hadn't spoken to me in 8 years, a fact she'd admitted herself during yesterday's meeting. He picked up the photo Rachel had submitted as evidence, the one showing me answering phones at the reception desk. Rachel looked triumphant for a moment until Park asked what exactly this photo was supposed to prove. Doctors in small practices helped with administrative tasks all the time. I explained I had one receptionist who occasionally needed backup when she was sick or overwhelmed by call volume. I covered the front desk the same way I cleaned exam rooms when our custodian couldn't make it in. No job was beneath me, and I'd never understood why Rachel thought helping my staff made me less professional. I looked at her directly and noted she'd thought it made me small, when I'd always considered it part of being a good employer. A commotion erupted outside the conference room. The door flew open and Sarah appeared looking panicked, with 8 or 10 patients crowded in the waiting room behind her. She apologized profusely and explained they'd heard about an investigation questioning whether I was a real doctor. Mrs. Kowalski pushed past Sarah into the conference room and declared the accusation was completely insane since I'd been her physician for 6 years. She turned to Park and told him I'd found her stage 1 breast cancer during a routine exam. Early detection had saved her life, and she was in remission now because of my thoroughness. Another patient with a cane explained I'd diagnosed his diabetes before he'd shown any symptoms, while a young mother shared that I'd delivered her baby right here in the clinic when she couldn't make it to the hospital in time. Rachel seemed to shrink into her chair while my parents watched in shock. I stood and addressed my patients, asking them to please go home because the situation was being handled. Mrs. Kowalski demanded to know if these people were actually accusing me of fraud, but I assured her everything was being resolved and thanked everyone for their concern. They left reluctantly, still muttering about the absurdity of anyone questioning my credentials. Chen waited until the door closed before pulling out a new folder. She suggested we discuss the real reason Rachel had filed this complaint, then laid out bankruptcy documents showing Rachel Harris had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in October 2024. Total debt of $312,000, including $240,000 in business loans co-signed by Robert and Linda Harris, plus $72,000 in credit card debt. Robert's face went pale as Chen explained their daughter's wellness spa had failed after 18 months of operation. A bank foreclosure notice on their Connecticut home had been filed November 1st. Linda's voice rose to a near shriek as she processed the information that they were losing their house. Rachel stammered that she'd been planning to tell them, which made Robert demand to know when exactly she'd intended to share this news. Chen provided the timeline. Unless the debt was paid by January 15th, the bank would take possession of their home. She showed Park the text messages again where Rachel had asked me for a $50,000 loan. Rachel's plan had been transparent in hindsight. Destroy my medical practice with false accusations, make me desperate enough to need family support, then use reconciliation as leverage to extract money from me. The financial motive made this complaint worse than simple jealousy. It was calculated extortion that had failed spectacularly. Robert stood up with his face flushed red and his hands clenched into fists. He told Rachel she'd lied to them by claiming this complaint was about protecting patients from a fraud. Rachel tried to insist she'd genuinely believed I was committing crimes, but Robert cut her off by pointing out she'd known about the name change and could have verified my credentials with a single database search. Linda sobbed harder while demanding to know if they were really losing their home because of Rachel's failed business. Rachel's voice turned defensive as she claimed she'd been trying to save the family. Robert exploded at this justification and asked if destroying her brother's career was her idea of salvation. Rachel's response came out as a near scream. I wasn't her brother because I'd abandoned them all years ago. I corrected this narrative in a cold, flat voice by explaining I'd left home to build my own life, which wasn't the same as abandonment. They'd never tried to find me. Rachel argued I'd moved and changed my name, making it impossible to locate me. I pointed out that searching Michael Anderson Dr. Boston would have brought up my practice as the first result on any search engine. The excuses were crumbling faster than she could manufacture new ones. Park closed his folder and announced his official decision. The complaint was completely baseless, my credentials were impeccable, and my practice was entirely legitimate. He'd issue formal clearance immediately, and this investigation wouldn't affect my insurance contracts in any way. I thanked him quietly while he turned to Rachel and explained he'd be reporting this incident to the Massachusetts Insurance Commission. Filing a false complaint was a misdemeanor at minimum, possibly elevated to a felony given the clear financial motive. Rachel tried to claim she'd made an honest mistake, but Park's response was firm and unforgiving. She'd signed legal documents and submitted notarized affidavits, which made this perjury rather than a simple error in judgment. Chen stood and adopted her formal attorney posture. She announced that I'd be filing a civil lawsuit against all three of them, which made Robert ask why he and Linda were included. Chen explained they'd co-signed the complaint and were therefore legally liable for its consequences. Defamation, interference with business operations, and emotional distress would be the primary claims, with damages sought in the amount of $500,000. Linda protested that they didn't have anywhere near that kind of money. Chen's response was matter of fact. They'd lose their house to foreclosure anyway, and depending on the criminal charges, they might face jail time as well. Rachel called this entire situation insane, which gave me the opening I'd been waiting for. I looked at her and stated plainly that she'd tried to have me imprisoned on false charges. These were just the natural consequences of her actions. Park gathered his materials and left the conference room while my parents stood and started collecting their coats. Rachel remained seated, staring at the table in stunned silence. I walked to the door and stopped with my hand on the handle. "One question," I said. Rachel's head came up slowly while I asked if she would have helped me if our situations had been reversed. If I'd been the one drowning in debt and had asked her for $50,000 to save myself. The silence stretched out for nearly 30 seconds before Rachel opened her mouth but couldn't form any words that answered the question. "That's what I thought," I said. I looked at my parents and told them they'd raised Rachel to believe she mattered more than me. She'd internalized that lesson completely, and so had they. Now, all three of them would face the consequences of that belief system together. I walked out and let the door close behind me. Behind that door, Linda's sobs echoed through the empty conference room while Robert stared at the bankruptcy documents spread across the table. Rachel's phone started ringing with a call from the Massachusetts Insurance Commission. She didn't answer it. 2 weeks after the auditor's visit, the Massachusetts district attorney filed formal charges against all three of them. Rachel faced 1 count of insurance fraud as a felony and 1 count of filing a false complaint as a misdemeanor. My parents were charged with conspiracy to file a false report, both misdemeanors given their ages and lack of criminal history. The court set bail at $10,000 each and scheduled the trial for March 2025. I didn't attend the arraignment. Chen sent me the case file along with something else she'd been investigating, Rachel's complete employment history. I reviewed the documents in her office 3 days before Christmas, while downtown Boston bustled with holiday shoppers who had no idea their lives were so much simpler than mine. Rachel had been fired from Atlantic Insurance in 2019 for approving fraudulent claims. Northeast Insurance had terminated her in 2021 for falsifying customer records. Bay State Insurance had let her go in 2023 for ethics violations. She'd been unemployed for 8 months before filing the complaint against me. Chen pointed out this wasn't just desperation, it was a pattern of behavior. The records showed Rachel had filed complaints against 2 of her former employers, both dismissed as baseless. She had a strategy that became obvious once you saw it documented across years of failures. When things didn't go her way, she found someone else to blame and tried to destroy them instead of accepting responsibility. My parents had never known about any of the firings because Rachel told them she was consulting. A letter arrived from the Massachusetts Board of Medicine on December 20th. The investigation had taken exactly 14 days to complete and found the complaint against me to be malicious and entirely unfounded. My credentials were verified as exemplary, my license remained active with no restrictions, and the board apologized for any inconvenience the investigation had caused. The complainant had been flagged in their system for potential abuse of the complaint process. I framed the letter and hung it next to my medical license in the conference room where my family had tried to destroy me. It felt like the smallest possible victory, but victories were still victories. Local news picked up the story 3 days later with a headline about a family doctor cleared after false fraud accusations. A reporter showed up at the clinic asking for an interview, and I gave her exactly 2 sentences on camera. I was focused on my patients because that's what mattered, and I felt nothing about my family's accusations because they weren't my family anymore. The clinic's Google reviews spiked from 4.2 to 4.9 stars overnight. 73 new 5-star reviews appeared, talking about how I was the best doctor in Boston and how patients stood by me through false accusations. Appointment requests tripled within a week, forcing me to extend office hours and start a waiting list for new patients. The community had spoken, and they'd chosen my side. Chen called me between patients on January 7th with news about my parents' house. The bank had auctioned it the previous day for $380,000, which covered most of Rachel's business debt. Robert and Linda were moving to a senior apartment complex with help from my Aunt Diane. I told Chen I was glad they had support from someone. She asked if I'd reconsider the lawsuit given they were losing their home, and I said no without hesitation. They'd lost the house when they co-signed Rachel's irresponsible loans. I was just choosing not to stop the natural consequences of their own decisions. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Rachel's public defender negotiated a plea deal in mid-January that reduced the insurance fraud charge from a felony to a misdemeanor. She received 18 months in federal prison followed by 3 years of probation, permanent banishment from the insurance industry, and an order to pay $25,000 in restitution to the insurance commission. My parents accepted a probation deal, 2 years with no jail time given their age and first offense status. I read the sentencing documents alone in my office after the last patient left for the day. 18 months felt simultaneously too long and not nearly long enough for someone who'd tried to destroy my entire life. I stared out the window at the parking lot and wondered if that constituted justice or just bureaucratic efficiency. The civil lawsuit settled in February for $200,000, significantly reduced from the original $500,000 we'd demanded. Rachel was declared judgment-proof due to her bankruptcy, so my parents had to pay $50,000 from their house sale proceeds while the insurance company contributed the remaining $150,000 to close the case quickly. I donated my parents' entire $50,000 portion to a medical charity that provided free care to underserved communities. Chen asked why I'd give away money I was legally entitled to keep, and I explained that I didn't want their money. I wanted them to know I didn't need it. Making their contribution irrelevant was more painful than keeping it would have been. I used the insurance company's $150,000 to expand the practice. In March, I hired Dr. Sarah Chen as a pediatrician, no relation to my attorney despite the shared last name. We added 4 new exam rooms and changed the sign outside to read Boston Family Medicine, Anderson and Chen, MDs, in clean, modern letters. The grand reopening drew a small crowd of patients who brought cards and flowers like it was a wedding instead of a business expansion. Mrs. Kowalski gave a short speech about how I'd saved her life and was now positioned to save many more lives in the community. I thanked everyone and said this was what actually mattered. Not headlines or lawsuits, just the work itself. My extended family split down predictable lines once the news spread beyond Boston. Aunt Diane sent texts asking if I could forgive my parents since they were so devastated. Uncle Tom called me cruel and said they'd just made a mistake. Cousin Jennifer messaged her support and agreed what they'd done was unforgivable. Cousin Marcus accused me of tearing the family apart by refusing to stick together. I responded to Aunt Diane with a single word. No. I blocked Uncle Tom's number entirely. I thanked Cousin Jennifer for understanding. I told Cousin Marcus that I hadn't torn anything apart. Our parents had done that by choosing to believe lies without verification. Then I unfriended 14 relatives on social media, kept the 3 cousins who'd supported me, and deleted myself from the family group chat that had been silent since December anyway. A handwritten letter arrived at the clinic in late March with Linda's careful cursive filling 2 pages of floral stationery. She wrote that they knew they'd hurt me and were so sorry, that they hadn't known Rachel was lying and had trusted her, that they'd lost their home and were living in a 1-bedroom apartment now. Robert had health problems, and they didn't have good insurance anymore. She knew they didn't deserve my help, but I was still their son, and couldn't we at least talk so they could explain everything properly? I read the entire letter twice before folding it and filing it in my desk drawer. They wanted to explain their side after 8 years of never asking about mine. The mathematics of that exchange didn't balance no matter how I calculated it, so I never responded to the letter or any of the 3 phone messages Linda left over the following weeks. Boston Magazine contacted me in April about featuring me in their Top 40 Doctors Under 40 issue. The interview happened over coffee near my clinic with a journalist who asked surprisingly good questions about how I'd coped with false accusations from my own family. I told her I'd focused on my patients because they were why I'd become a doctor in the first place. She asked if I regretted cutting off my family entirely. I regret that it was necessary, I said. Not that I did it. The article published in May with a photo of me in my white coat standing in front of the newly expanded clinic. 3 former medical school classmates reached out to congratulate me, and I realized I hadn't spoken to any of them in years because I'd been so focused on building my practice that I'd forgotten to maintain friendships. I started making plans to change that. At a medical conference in June, I ran into Dr. Sarah Chen during a presentation on pediatric care integration in family practices. We got coffee afterward and talked about the challenges of running a small clinic in an era of corporate medicine. She asked about the insurance auditor story she'd heard through the medical community gossip network. I confirmed it was all unfortunately true. Sarah's expression shifted to something between sympathy and respect when she processed that my own sister had tried to destroy me. She asked if I was still angry about what happened, and I explained that anger required energy I'd rather spend on learning and growing. Therapy had helped me understand that holding on to rage would only give them continued power over my emotional state. She smiled and said, "That was actually really healthy for someone who'd been through trauma." 3 years of therapy, I told her. Best investment I ever made. A letter arrived from FCI Danbury Federal Prison in August with Rachel's inmate number printed on the return address. She'd had time to think and realize she was wrong. That money desperation had clouded her judgment. That prison therapy was helping her understand her patterns. She knew she couldn't undo what she'd done, but hoped I might forgive her someday. And would I consider writing a letter to the parole board when her hearing came up in a few months? I read the letter once, felt absolutely nothing, and wrote a single word on the prison stationery. No. I signed my name, put it in the return envelope, and mailed it back the same day. When Chen called later that week and asked what I'd told Rachel about the parole letter, I repeated the same single word. Chen laughed and said good, which made me feel like I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. Late one night in September, I sat alone in my office finishing paperwork after a long day of back-to-back appointments. A framed photo on my desk showed me at my Johns Hopkins graduation, wearing my medical school whites and holding my diploma. I was alone in the photo because no one had come to watch me graduate. No parents, no sister, no extended family who'd all been too busy with Rachel's work event that same weekend. I picked up the photo and studied my younger self's proud expression. People kept asking if I was happy now that everything had been resolved legally and professionally. I never knew how to answer that question because happiness felt like the wrong metric to measure against. I had a successful practice, good colleagues, and patients who trusted me with their lives and health. But I had no family. No siblings to call on birthdays, no parents to visit on holidays, no cousins who'd want me at their weddings. Was it worth it? My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah asking about dinner tomorrow at her place. I looked at the photo again, then at the text, then back at the photo of my solitary graduation day. Some losses were necessary even when they hurt, and maybe that was the only answer that mattered. I put the photo face down in the drawer and texted back a simple yes. The paperwork could wait until morning. My 36th birthday fell on December 30th, 2025, exactly 1 year after the insurance auditor had walked into my clinic with my family trailing behind him. The celebration happened in my condo with 8 people gathered around a cake that read, "Happy 36th birthday, Dr. Anderson," in blue frosting. Sarah Chen stood beside me while Margaret Chen, my attorney-turned-friend, raised a glass of wine. Dr. Sarah Chen, my clinic partner with the confusingly identical name, laughed at something one of my colleagues said. Mrs. Kowalski sat in my most comfortable chair, looking pleased with herself for organizing this entire event without my knowledge. The atmosphere felt warm and genuine in a way last year's birthday never had. Sarah mentioned that exactly 1 year ago I'd been dealing with the audit, and I acknowledged it had been a different life back then. Mrs. Kowalski corrected me and said I was a different man now, but I disagreed with her assessment. I was the same person, just lighter somehow, unburdened by the weight of family members who'd never actually seen me. Attorney Chen proposed a toast to justice, but I quietly changed it to peace instead. One of my colleagues asked about Rachel during the party, specifically whether she'd been released from prison yet. I confirmed her early release had happened in November after serving 13 months of her 18-month sentence. Her parole officer had contacted me to explain she was prohibited from any contact with me for 3 years as part of her probation conditions. Sarah asked if that restriction bothered me. I told her the truth. Even if the no-contact order expired tomorrow, I still wouldn't talk to Rachel because there was nothing left to say between us. The conversation moved on quickly because no one at this gathering cared about Rachel's situation beyond basic curiosity. Attorney Chen mentioned that my parents had sent a Christmas card to her office earlier that month, which she'd returned unopened per my standing instructions. Dr. Chen asked if I ever wondered how they were doing, and I explained my Aunt Diane sent occasional updates without being asked. They were fine, living in a senior community with subsidized rent, managing their health problems with Medicare. Someone asked if I felt guilty about their reduced circumstances. I feel nothing, I said. That's better than anger. The party continued with talk of the clinic's upcoming one-year anniversary as Anderson and Chen Family Medicine. Dr. Chen shared that we'd treated 892 new patients in the past year, nearly doubling our practice size. I noted the settlement money from the lawsuit had gone to good use, which made Mrs. Kowalski laugh and point out that Rachel had tried to destroy me, but I'd built something even bigger from the wreckage. I corrected her gently. Rachel had tried to destroy someone she thought was small and insignificant. She'd never actually known who I was, so her attack had been against a phantom version of me that existed only in her imagination. The next evening, I stopped at Trader Joe's on my way to Sarah's apartment for New Year's Eve dinner. The store was crowded with last-minute shoppers stocking up on champagne and appetizers. I reached for a bag of coffee beans on the shelf and my hand touched another hand reaching for the same bag. I looked up and saw Rachel. She'd lost weight in prison, her face thinner and more angular than I remembered. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a Target sweater and jeans that had seen better days. Prison pallor made her skin look grayish under the fluorescent store lights. We both froze for a long moment. She said my name and I said hers, and then silence stretched between us in the coffee aisle while other shoppers pushed their carts past us. Rachel started to say she wanted to tell me something, but I cut her off with a single word and picked up the coffee. I walked away without looking back, though I could feel her watching me until I turned the corner toward the checkout lanes. That night at Sarah's apartment, I told her about the encounter while we cooked dinner together. She stopped chopping vegetables and asked if I was okay, and I confirmed I was fine because I'd felt absolutely nothing during the interaction. Sarah asked whether that numbness was good or bad, which was exactly the question I'd been asking myself. Sometimes I wondered if I should feel more, anger or sadness, or even pity for the sister who'd destroyed her own life trying to destroy mine. Sarah pointed out that I could only feel what I actually felt, and apathy wasn't morally wrong. My therapist had said the same thing multiple times over the past 3 years. Sarah asked if I missed having family, which made me look around her apartment at the photos covering her walls. Pictures of us at the clinic reopening, of me and my colleagues at conferences, of Mrs. Kowalski's remission celebration party. I have family, I told her, just not the one I was born into. The following Monday morning, our new receptionist Jenna struggled with the phone system during the early rush of appointment calls. I sat down at the front desk and walked her through the process while she apologized for not knowing it already. Dr. Chen walked past and made a teasing comment about me helping with reception again, but I told Jenna no job was too small when you were part of a team. A medical student shadowing me that day seemed surprised that I actually answered phones like Rachel's photo had shown. I confirmed I did this sometimes and asked if that was a problem. The student admitted most doctors wouldn't do administrative work, to which I replied those doctors were missing the entire point of running a practice focused on patient care rather than ego. Later that morning, Mr. Torres brought up the story about my family's accusations during his exam. He'd heard about it through the patient gossip network and wanted to express his opinion that they'd been completely wrong about me. I thanked him for the support, and he asked why I stayed at a small clinic when I could work at a big hospital with my credentials and reputation. Big hospitals treat diseases, I explained. I treat people. Mr. Torres nodded and said that was a good answer, so I told him it was also the true answer, the real reason I'd chosen this particular path through medicine. That evening, I sat alone in my office writing patient notes after the last appointment had finished. The quiet of the empty clinic gave me space to think about the question people kept asking, whether I regretted cutting off my family completely. I regretted that it had been necessary, but not that I'd actually done it. My sister had thought answering phones made me small and insignificant. My parents had assumed I was a failure because I hadn't continuously updated them on every success. None of them had understood the fundamental truth that I didn't need them to see me or validate my accomplishments. I'd needed to stop waiting for them to look in my direction. Revenge would have been proving them wrong and forcing them to acknowledge their mistake. Peace was making their opinions completely irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. I hadn't won some kind of war against my family. I'd simply stopped fighting a battle that had never been mine to win in the first place. At 7 that evening, I locked the clinic doors and walked to the parking lot where Sarah waited in her car. Light snow had started falling, coating everything in a thin layer of white that would probably be gone by morning. I got in the passenger seat and Sarah asked about my day. "Good day," I said. "Mr. Torres's cancer screening came back clear." We drove through the quiet streets while I watched the clinic sign fade in the rearview mirror. Anderson and Chen Family Medicine in clean, modern letters that represented everything I'd built from nothing. Sarah asked what I was thinking about, and I told her I'd built something real and solid that belonged entirely to me. She agreed I had, which prompted me to clarify that I'd done it for myself rather than to prove anything to my family. "That's the best reason," she said. Sarah asked if I was happy now that a year had passed and everything had settled into a new normal. I paused before answering because happiness felt like the wrong metric to measure against. I was at peace, which seemed more valuable than happiness in the long term. Sarah asked if peace was really better than happiness. I explained that happiness depended on external circumstances that constantly changed, while peace came from internal acceptance that remained stable regardless of what happened around you. Sarah laughed and said I sounded very zen for a family medicine doctor, so I reminded her that 3 years of therapy was expensive enough that I needed to sound wise to justify the cost. We drove into the snow while I thought about how some stories don't end with victory or vindication. They end with acceptance of what is rather than grief over what could have been. That was enough for me.